Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining our webinar, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly on the final EBA RTS today. I'm Richard Deere, Business Development Director at Icon Solutions, and with me today are two colleagues, Tom Hay and Chris Comm. Hello. So I'll just quickly introduce the guys. So Tom is our Head of Payments with a long and distinguished career. This includes CTO and co-founder of Nomad, Head of Architecture and Design at Focalink, and the Chief Architect at Zap. At Icon, Tom has recently been the driving force behind the creation of our Instant Payments Framework, which effectively codifies our many years of expertise in instant payments in a flexible modern solution for banks and PSPs. Also with us is Chris. Chris was a Senior Manager Research and Development at American Express, where he worked on the TfL contactless and Apple Pay projects. Prior to Icon, he was Head of Payments Innovation and New Product Development at RBS. Most recently, Chris has been appointed Co-Chair of the Identification Group for the ERPB PSD2 Working Group, and he's been working with various central banks on that one, and congratulations on that appointment, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you.
So if we quickly do some housekeeping. So, firstly, the webinar will be available on demand later today, so don't worry too much about trying to write stuff down or screen print stuff. You can get a copy later. Secondly, please bear in mind that we're payments experts, we're not lawyers, so check this with the relevant authorities, particularly your compliance departments. Finally, we'll try and pause for questions as we go, so please submit the questions. We've got a lot of ground to cover and there's a lot of text on the slides, so we may try and save questions to the end as well to try and keep the flow going. Also at the end, we'll provide details of some events coming up where you'll be able to chat with us in person, so that will be as we get to the end of the show. So without further ado, over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Richard. The background to this is that we have been tracking the development of PSD2 for over 2 years, working with various clients on this. And when the draft RTS on SCA and Secure Communication was published, we put out a blog and white paper talking about the 10 key points. Now, unfortunately, Richard said that we're not lawyers, we're also not accountants, so counting up to 10 was too much of a challenge, so we've now gone to 11 points.
Spinal tap. This one goes to 11.
And so those 11 points are what we are going to be discussing today. So with no further ado, we'll go into point number 1, which is the banks are to define their own interfaces. Icon's verdict on that is that it is good, but frankly, no thanks to the EBA. When we first started looking at the PSD2 proposals, and particularly the API interfaces, as I said, over 2 years ago, we saw immediately that there was a possibility of API anarchy, because everyone goes off and defines their own APIs, and that would be disastrous for interoperability. I think the community of PSPs in Europe were hoping for something like the SEPA process, where the EPC published rule books which gave quite detailed specifications of the interfaces, the data contents, the flows, etc., etc. But anyone who is familiar with other regulatory technical standards published by the EBA will know that that is not the way that they are. As some people have said, they're certainly not technical, and they're sometimes barely even standards. And certainly in comment 224, the EBA themselves say, we're not going to go into detail, you know, it's up to you, figure it out for yourselves. So kind of thinking about this approach, I was reminded of a scene from Shakespeare in Love, where one of the characters says, let me explain to you about this business. The natural condition is one of insurmountable obstacles on the road to imminent disaster. The other guy says, what do we do? The answer is nothing. Strangely enough, it all turns out well. How? Well, I don't know. It's a mystery. And that's approximately where we are here. You know, how is this interoperability going to be achieved? We don't know. It's a mystery. So into that gap, luckily, have stepped the ERPB and a number of industry groups, such as the Berlin Group and the Paris Group, who have said, look, we're going to take it upon ourselves to fill in these gaps that are just missing. And so industry-defined standards are going to be available, which PSPs will be able to adhere to. Unfortunately, those are not going to be available, I would guess, until at least mid-year, which leaves very, very little time to actually implement them and test the interoperability. So what else is going on? Well, a number of industry groups have also said, right, we are going to move into the space of meta-aggregation. So we accept that there is going to be anarchy from the ASPSPs. They'll all be defining their own APIs. We will sit as a middle layer between them and the third parties, and we will provide out a single API definition to the third parties by standardizing or mapping all of the different bank APIs into this single standard. So organizations like CAPS and PRETA and FIGO are all moving into this space. We see that as being beneficial for TPPs, but less so for banks, and it's certainly another hungry mouth to feed in an already extended value chain.
So, Tom, a question on that one then. So to complete your Shakespeare reference, does the fact that they're all using ISO 20022 just mean that all's well that ends well?
Very nice, Richard. And I wish it did. There are references to ISO 20022 in the RTS, and they do seem to treat it a bit like a magic wand, that if we wave that standard, somehow everything will start working. But as anyone who has ever used ISO 20022 knows, that is unfortunately not the case. It's a horrifically complicated standard. There are lots of optional fields. The interpretation of what they all mean is different. And so the mere fact that everyone uses ISO 20022, or even data elements from ISO 20022, which I think is the exact wording, that absolutely does not guarantee interoperability, sadly.
Okay.
Right, point two. APIs, not screen scraping. So Andreas Enria, chairman, stood up at a conference in London just before the RTS was published and said, screen scraping is outlawed, it will not be allowed. And indeed, that is reflected in Rationale 32. Now, if that were true, that would be great, but we don't think that it's quite what it's cracked up to be. So we actually think this is a little bit ugly. What the RTS says is that a bank must offer an interface to TPPs, which conforms to the regulation, but it is up to the bank or the ASPSP whether that should be a dedicated interface for the exclusive use of TPPs, which I think is generally accepted that those would be APIs, or whether to reuse the online interface that is used by their own payment service users customers. Using the same interface as the customers, well, that's kind of what screen scraping is. The screen scraper sits as a man in the middle and presents their own branded screens to the customer, captures the customer data and relays it to the bank. So they're kind of pretending to be the customer. So if that's the definition of screen scraping, then there is at least an additional bit of security which is mandated by the RTS. It says that third parties that are using this approach must identify themselves to the bank using digital certificates and digital signatures. So at least the bank is sure that it is a bona fide authorized TPP who is doing this screen scraping, rather than just some hacker who happens to have intercepted someone's browser session. I don't think that is that's sufficient for security purposes. It gets rid of bad actors pretending to be TPPs, but there are still two problems. One is that inevitably there is a break in cryptography. The secure session from the browser to the bank is no longer intact. There is a secure session from the browser to the TPP and a separate secure session from the TPP to the bank. In the middle there is a break in crypto, which no matter how careful the TPP is a new attack vector, which didn't exist before. The second thing is that what customers are being asked to do now is to key their bank security credentials into a non-bank screen. Banks have spent a lot of time and a lot of money saying, don't do that, only ever enter your credentials into the bank screen. Now they're being told to do exactly the opposite. So that's also opening up the possibility of social engineering attacks, phishing, etc. So there will be a lot of customer education required to make sure that people don't accidentally give away their security credentials.
Cool, thank you. And some of those organisations that have spent years building up businesses based on screen scraping are going to have to find other things to do then.
Well, they can still use the interfaces, and they're making a lot of noise in the marketplace at the moment as if the sky is falling. That's not the case. They have to put additional security in place, and any ASPSP, any bank that is offering the online interface, that will be pretty similar to what these TPPs are doing today. If the bank opts to stand up a dedicated interface, an API interface, well, yes, then the TPP will have to use that API interface instead of the screen scraping one. But the whole point of APIs is that they are designed for machine-to-machine communication, which is what the TPPs are doing. The online interfaces were designed for human users, and so they use something called HTML, which is designed to show, pretty colors and different fonts and so on and so forth, which a payment initiation message, it really doesn't care about that. So it should actually be easier for the TPPs to use the dedicated APIs rather than have to do this screen scraping and take into account lots of changes in the HTML.
Perfect. Okay, let's go to the next point.
Third point is that the payment security is up to the banks, and we think that's a good thing, unreservedly. We've talked to some people who have the impression that as a TPP they could issue security credentials to customers. Customers would authenticate themselves to the TPP, and then the TPP would just tell the bank to go do it. Not the case. The RTS says that payment initiation service providers can rely on the ASPSPs, the banks, for authentication, but not vice versa. It doesn't mention vice versa. So it's up to the banks to authenticate the customers. So we see the interaction between the customer, the payment initiation service provider, and the bank as having three phases. There is the define phase, when the customer tells the TPP what they want to do. For example, make a payment to this beneficiary of this amount. There's a delegate phase where the TPP passes control to the ASPSP, to the bank, and says, right, please authenticate this customer for me. And it's then up to the bank to apply whatever two-factor authentication they think or they deem to be appropriate for that particular situation. And that might be secure mobile, it might be a PIN Sentry type device to prove possession, but as long as it's the two-factor authentication to any two of the three knowledge, possession and inherence factors, then that's fine. And the bank, the ASPSP, passes back the authentication code to the TPP, says, okay, the customer is now authenticated, and so define, delegate, the final stage is the do phase, at which point the TPP says, right, now I've got my permission to execute this payment, and they ask the bank to go for it. You'll notice in the bottom left-hand corner we've got the little logo of PayPal saying sorry. various reasons for that. One is that particular screen isn't using two-factor authentication, it's using username and password, so that wouldn't pass muster anyway. But there is some interesting controversy about PayPal's status. Are they an ASPSP? Well, they're sort of operating accounts, so probably, but I don't think they're very keen to open up APIs to the rest of the world to allow other third parties to initiate payments from their accounts. Are they a PISP at the moment? Well, not at the moment. If PayPal takes funds from my account, they will do it either via a direct debit or via a card on file transaction, neither of which require PayPal to become a PISP. So they might get away without becoming a PISP, unless they want to start using credit push type methods.
Okay, perfect. I think that go on to the next slide now, and we'll save some questions on that one for the end. We're starting to get some questions coming from the audience, so keep them coming.
Thanks. So the next 2 points are quite closely related. Generation of authentication codes. In the draft version, there was quite a bit of confusion as to whether an authentication code was an output, i.e. something that was generated when the customer had securely or strongly authenticated themselves, or whether it was an input, a code that the bank, a one-time password, essentially. That's now cleaned up in this draft, so that's good, but there is still sufficient inconsistencies here for us to say that overall it's still a bit ugly. The reason for that is that the authentication codes that are generated, the RTS says it's usable, it's accepted only once. Now that's great for a one-off payment initiation, but the SCA is also supposed to handle a sequence of payments of the same value, and it's also supposed to allow the account information service providers to repeatedly request information. In both of those cases, the TPP would need to present the authentication code each time that they go dip in the well again, so to speak. But if the authentication code is for one-off use only, well, how on earth is that going to work? There's also another quite interesting point, which is the authentication code isn't what I call a golden ticket. So once you've got an authenticator, once a TPP has got an authentication code, particularly payment initiation service provider, that is not a cast iron guarantee that the ASPSP is going to be able to execute the payment when the TPP comes to cash in this token. Various reasons why it may fail. The TPP may have lost their authorization by the time they come to cash in the ticket. The account may not have sufficient funds, and banks operate accounts that are not allowed to go overdrawn. So at the time that the authentication code was issued, fine, there were sufficient funds to cover the transaction there, but by the time it's cashed in, sorry, insufficient funds, you can't have your payment. So there is a bit of a hole, or a couple of holes there. What's going to happen about this? Well, I think it's a bit unlikely that the EBA is going to come out with an amended final draft. So I think there's going to have to be a bit of flexibility and a bit of inventiveness on behalf of the payment service providers to get around this problem.
Cool. So a quick question we've had in, which is, in the world of cards, auth code's been around for ages. Is this not the same thing?
It's a bit of a different thing. For cards, an auth code is a 6-digit code which is returned by the card issuer when they authorize the transaction, and it generally gets printed on a receipt. It's a little piece of identification that's a quasi-proof that the issuer said yes to it. But as you can imagine, it's only 6 digits. That means that after 1 million transactions, you would run out of auth code. So it's not like this or authentication code, where it is supposed to be one-off, unique for all time. So it's a bit of a different concept.
Okay, thank you. So over to point 5.
Point 5, as I said, very, very much linked to the previous point, but we think this one is also pretty ugly. So having generated an authentication code which says, yes, this customer has proved that they really are who they claim to be, the RTS says that then needs to be dynamically linked to the particular transaction that the TPP wants to carry out. This is also only applicable to payment initiation service providers. So if you look at the wording on the left, Article 5 says in accordance with Article 972, which is only for payment initiation. But elsewhere, the RTS says that account information service providers get permission to get the information 90 days, up to 90 days after the permission is granted, and 4 times by default. But with the customer's agreement, that can be more frequent. So when the customer gives permission and says, yeah, I want you to be able to get the balance 8 times a day, they have given permission to a specific set of parameters associated with that account information. And unless you bind the authentication code to that, then how is the ASPSP going to say, yes, that actually the customer gave the permission for the more frequent dipping into the well? The RTS doesn't mandate that, so I think it's up to ASPSPs to figure out how they're going to handle that. They will have to do some kind of binding internally. There is also questions about, okay, ASPSP is going to have to log how many times an ISP has accessed them, when that consent expires, etc., etc. And there also needs to be an option for a payment service user to revoke their permission. So I might say to an account service provider, yeah, I'm going to give you permission to get my account details. After a week, I discover that all I'm getting on my lovely dashboard is adverts and spam. So I say, look, to hell with this. I just want to cancel this. I want to take away your permission to get at my account. So there has to be an option to cancel that.
Cool. Thank you very much, Tom, for those first 5 points. Now over to you, Chris, for the remaining points.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks, Tom. These are obviously interlinked as well, so I'm going to be harking back to some of the things that Tom said. The next one we've got is number 6, exemptions from SCA, and our verdict was overwhelmingly good. There was a lot of talk previously about minimal exemptions. I think we wrote very briefly about the binary, is there SCA, is there no SCA, and the lack of step up. And what they've kind of done is provide various rules now to support being able to step up or enforcing. In terms of the articles, you can see them there. We won't go into detail, but they're effectively sort of use cases and by instrument. So you've got payment account information and the contactless, which has actually gone to €50. That's slightly different in the UK. So we'll align that. And it also goes to 5, which is higher than we had before, which is 3. Transport and parking. So, I mean, you mentioned I work in TfL. Obviously there's very sensible reasons there, but I'm not sure if the rest of Europe is actually operating them as well. So we may see changes there. Trusted beneficiaries and payments itself, no-brainer, obviously. And now we have the sort of change for low-value transactions, which are very helpfully split into remote card and to the new credit transfer initiated by the PISP. €30 is the limit, up to €100, or 5 consecutive transactions, which is loads of rules to kind of now operate where you didn't have them before. On top of all of that, then we now have the sort of the transaction risk analysis and the ETV, the score and the value that the bank holds for the amount of fraud that it's operated so far. And I think the long story short on that is the better a bank's ETV score, the more you can exempt, but obviously the more they'll be liable for if they do exempt it. For those banks that don't do particularly well and have a very high ETV and TRA score, we'd imagine that you challenge your customer each time they do a transaction. They're not going to be very happy about that either. So, bit of an interesting UX outcome that's going to happen at the end. The last part is just sort of it's not exempt throughout. It's a 5-transaction counter. So we will see things like the Amazon one-click and Uber. Bit of an open question as to whether you have to sit in the cab on your 5th Uber ride and then get your card reader out just to prove that you were who you were to then do your background billing. But I'm sure the industry will be having discussions about that. We talk about that in a bit.
Cool, perfect. Okay, we're still getting lots of questions in, but let's save them for the end. So 8.7.
Fraud, number 7 is real-time fraud detection and prevention. It's very much linked to the previous point, and reading through that, we thought that this was good. There is, static fraud prevention and just holding some of this data and then assessing each one, and then this real-time element where you're counting the previous transactions, or you're looking at the periodicity of the previous period, or if something happens in the industry, you'll change it. I think the ETV was quite confusing, and I'm more than happy to explain that offline. But there's going to be all manners of graphs and curves and tables, but probably need a new team in the bank to be monitoring that, just in case it goes over and you're suddenly having to force your customers to do exemptions or non-exemptions again. In terms of the the operations for that, there's also reporting as well. The regulators themselves will be catching a lot more reports about it, and I'm sure industry fraud rates will be reported much higher. That also gives us opportunities to look at these man-in-the-middle type scenarios, and I'm sure there will be very ingenious people who will always figure out the way to do that. But we'll have a bit more metadata in the industry as well, so probably overall a good thing.
Cool. It sounds like it's a big step up and a challenge for existing fraud applications. So if you do have a genuinely real-time fraud system that can cope, does that give a bank a competitive advantage?
I think so, yeah, definitely. I mean, you imagine if it's not for real time, you're sort of waiting there, and the spinny wheel is going to be going for 20 seconds while they work out what they want to do. The data processing and the states that you hold on a customer, on the PISP, on all of the actors in the value chain has to become really quick for you to calculate and actually keep it seamless, which I think is what we want to do. But there's no point in exempting it whilst you still have to wait, for 5 minutes for them to time out.
Yeah.
I think some banks may need to have to step up their processing in real time.
Okay, on to point 8.
So sensitive payment data. Obviously, we thought this was bad at the top there. You can see the bandaged head, and I'll explain a bit why. When is sensitive data actually sensitive is a very subjective sort of term. For me, I think all of my data is sensitive, and actually what I'd really like is for Google to pay me every time they use my data, but I doubt that's going to happen. But the EBA doesn't really clearly define what is out of scope or in scope, apart from saying that your account balances and the last 90 days of what I can consider PRISM level, real insights into your spending habits, is more than happy to go to a third party. If you look at the little drawing that we did at the bottom left, you can see here that the PSU provides the SCA, the consent mechanism that Tom mentioned, so the 4, the 8, how many times I want them to access it. And effectively, from an interpretation, they can get up to the last 90 days or more if they provide that already for an ASPSP. So first shot, they get 90 days, and that's them reading you, and then, as you said, that's where the avalanche of advertising comes from Tom's Gmail. Beyond that, you don't have to do SCA then for the next 90 days. So they can come back for the 4 or 8 times during that day and just keep on requesting without you actually being there because you provided the consent. So whilst you may, and I have done this so many times, I've clicked on the I agree, just done a bit of security, and then we carry on. They may be accessing and harvesting data without you being aware for the 90 days, and the only time you'll know about it again is something happens to it, or they'll ask you for permission again. So it's a little bit dangerous there. In terms of the requirement for 27001, ISO 27001, yeah, that is a security standard which they've taken away. But then they also said that they want 2022, and we can't really understand why would you say ISO for one and not the other. Anyway. So ultimately, I think I'm just very much looking forward to paying for a Bitcoin and getting everyone's transaction data on the dark web, but we will see what happens with that.
Well, that's certainly a gloomy picture you're painting there. So I think we'll have that down as definitely one of the bad points. On to point 9.
Yes. I mean, I think ugly was a little bit harsh, but it wasn't quite bad, but it's definitely confusing. You can see here I've copied out the text in Article 29, certification, and at the bottom I've said, I've signed it, source, do trust me, is my PKI key. Now, at very quick speed, could you read that document and tell if I changed anything from the EBA to our dear listeners? They are the ones who've written it, and that should be the cast iron, that's what it says. But as I'm holding it, I can intercept and sort of replay it back to data. That's my very pokey analogy for how web certificates should really work. At a national level, the authorities will say, Tom is, HeyPay is now a PISP, and Dear Data is now an AISP, and they'll come to the Bank of Chris, and I will read their certificate and say, yes, that's okay. So fundamentally, and I'm just looking at one of the previous questions, is the IDAS kind of needed between the TPPs and the SPSPs? Yes, I believe so, because the banks are no longer doing their KYC, or at least their due diligence checks, and they rely on providing the non-discriminatory access on the authorities. In terms of the actual text itself, it does get a little bit confusing, mostly because the EBA is now talking about seals versus web certificates, yeah, and that itself can be a little bit confusing. What I would just say is do have a look at Annex 3 and 4 of the IDAS itself. There's a little bit of jiggery-pokery there, but it does become clear. But even when it does become clear, it's still very, very confusing and gets even worse when we look at the number of international TPPs trying to talk to the number of international banks at speed and making it secure. Assuming that we do manage to achieve all that, and that's what we're doing in the ERPB and various other groups like CAPS and Berlin Group, then we have to look at negative scenarios. So what happens when, as Tom said, a TPP fails to pay their tax and they get their license revoked, or where there's a massive incident of fraud coming from one country and we need a notice to say everyone needs to stop that. So a lot of dispute servicing and various other things need to be considered in a model like this. We don't have the answer today, but we will have them.
Perfect. Okay, well, let's go on to the next point. Slowly and surely on to the next point.
Is it going? Yeah.
We've got a sense of anticipation. You might be enthusiastic about the next one.
Where's it going forward?
We've got a stall on the presentation.
Yeah. Here we are.
Oh, okay. Slide 10, card not present requires SCA. Now we said good, but you can see down there, good old Benedict, this requires a hell of a lot of Sherlocking to work out what's going on. Just as an aside, I think we were one of the few detractors early in the market actually saying card not present is not going to fit, and 3D Secure is knowledge and knowledge. We were in a different country, we got shouted down for that actually as well. And then Visa and MasterCard obviously came back and said, yeah, that's our reading too. So score one for Icon. I think just combining all the stuff together, first and foremost, 3D Secure is a PAN and a piece of a password. And that's just two pieces of knowledge. The PAN is not in any way proving possession. I could photocopy or do whatever happened before. Article 1 says that all PSPs have to do the 2FA. Article 31.4 says that PISPs will, sort of share that data or handle that data. Then you get the comments, and this is where the Sherlocking really happens. The scope is in there. 52 says that card on file are out of scope, which is a little bit confusing. They don't have to register as PSPs. But then 87 says that payee can't trigger it. Back to Tom's point before, it falls back to the ASPSP, effectively, securities up to the banks to operate that. And it has to be 2FA. So, yes, a little bit confusing, but that is your answer, and please do read the quotes that we've got. We also have a terminology change as well. Card on file, card not present, etc. is now called remote card, and I think we'll just be referring to that now as the new model to avoid confusion. Equally, the new possession element within that needs to be figured out as well. We saw a very good card actually from Obiter, I don't know if they're on the call, but they have a changing 3-digit CVV that could potentially be used as possession. And equally, we already have very good biometrics and tokenization. Doesn't necessarily need to be cards, but mobile security is coming up there as well. Finally, the liability shift contract, I think, needs to still be done, particularly around credit transfer, and that money now gets sent immediately in instant. So how do you recover that, and how do you prove if you exempt it? All of those things work out.
Okay, perfect. And on to the final point.
Yes, my least favourite. Just as a background, obviously, we spent a lot of time working previously on Apple Pay, and we know a lot of the providers. We've spoken with GSMA, who've got some very good insight into this. Logging as one and mobile security as off definition, I think, is a little bit harsh to the EBA, but it's kind of what's happened. Trusted execution environment was really the gold standard. And at any point, please someone grab me and I'll explain you how the 4-key model and hardware actually works. But by changing trusted execution environment to secure execution environment, you've taken something that was globally recognized and had been validated and tested in the market and turned it into a nothing statement that has not been tested at all. So we're now back to the Wild West free for all. In terms of the way that we actually work through this now, our bottom point actually sort of points out that ASPSPs are actually now liable for whatever they want to do in secure execution environment, which again means nothing. So all the known attacks, or the industry work, or the penetration testing, if you don't go with something that is sort of agreed, then we should go for that. In terms of the actual ability to sort of say what the standards are, I'm kind of looking back to the GSMA and global platform and the OEMs again to really sort of put out their guidance, because they will know about what's secure and what's not. Ultimately, this is just very, very bad. I'm really hoping that we do work with the GSMA quite soon to be able to do that.
Cool. Okay, fantastic. So I think we've had a number of questions in from the audience, which we're now going to try and go to. So if we want to start with the one on the final RTS, Article 31, Paragraph 5, subpoint B. So the provision of account information will be done without customer explicit consent. Any idea about code generation for AISP?
We're assuming that's the authorization code, right?
Yeah. Or authentication. Yeah, I think we actually covered this earlier in that it's a shortcoming. The authentication code should be dynamically bound to the specific consent that the customer has given to the ASP for access to their account information. So the customer has consented by default to 90 days of access for up to 4 times a day. That may be explicitly varied, but whatever the customer has consented to should result in the generation of a token. Let's not call it an authentication code, but that token can be presented by the AISP to say, here is a token that you, ASPSP, granted me because you checked that your PSU had consented, and I will continue to use this until it expires, and then it's up to the ASPSP to check, yes, that token really does give access. Oh, and by the way, the AISP has not exceeded their allowed number of tries per day, etc.
So there's a number of industry mechanisms as well for that. I mean, OAuth and JSON Web token itself, which is where the name comes from. But also, caveat emptor, buyer beware. There's a lot of people who say that they'll do that for you. May not necessarily be doing that in a secure way either. Okay.
Cool. So I think the next one is a question on timing. So what are your views on what APIs need to be in place for January 2018 versus what are aligned with the RTS? Is it too simplistic to say no APIs need to be provided in January and all API SCA work is aligned with the RTS? What nuances exist? Long question there.
Gosh, yes. Let's try and parse that one. Is it true that no APIs need to be provided in January? So, strictly speaking, no APIs need to be provided at all. Every bank in Europe might decide we're not going to implement APIs, we are simply going to add the additional eIDAS identification of the TPPs to my existing online interface, and I'm just not going to bother with APIs. So strictly speaking, the answer to the first part of the question is no, you don't have to stand up an API by January as long as you have conformed to the security requirements of the existing HTML interface. Regarding all API/SCA work is aligned with RTS, that's a really thorny one because the SCA requirements themselves are not aligned with the January deadline for implementing PSD2. So there is an interim period between the PSD2 coming into force in January next year and the
18 months
RTS SCA coming into force, and when that happens, very much depends on the progress of the RTS through the remainder of its legislative journey. Chris, do you want to pick up on that?
To keep it really simple, the original legislation will come into force in January 2018. I think Article 65, 66, 67 says you'll do the PSP card, the PIS and the AIS. So you have to provide something within that. Unfortunately, it may not be secure. The customers may not be linked to FA, and it might look a bit disjointed, and that's the first instance. 18 months afterwards, we need to have cleaned it up to the point where it's all fully consistent with the RTS. The nuances, I guess, is how slick, if you're a bank, how slick do you want to be? And then also TPPs building up front now into something that's quite bad, and then actually having to redo it later. So again, everyone's kind of sitting in their camps. It'd be a lot easier if everyone just talked to each other and started working these things out now, and then build a industry or national plan to kind of phase out these things. The one thing I will say about RTS as well, which has happened before, is really strong industry customer education is going to be needed. So that's the thing that's missing out of all of this, is the customer experience needs to really be thought out, and people like my mother or new millennials, etc. All these security requirements and APIs, there's going to be strong industry messaging as well.
Okay, perfect. I think on a related topic, will the CMA work that is underway provide the first API standards? Will it help?
Who I get really confused about who is who, CMA or ODIE or...
Well, okay. So CMA work, there are a number of phases to the so-called CMA remedies. So CMA initially was only applicable to 9 of the UK banks. The CMA said you're not sufficiently competitive, you need to do some stuff to remedy that, and one of the things was you've got to provide information via open banking APIs. Phase 1 is publication of public information, such as the T's and C's of the different products that the banks offer, branch locations, branch details, ATM locations, and so on. So just public information. Next phase is provision of account information for individuals. So that has quite an overlap with the AISP requirement in PSD2. And then the third phase, which very strangely in UK parlance is called a read-write interface.
I don't really get that.
It's a complete misnomer, but that is being interpreted now to mean, well, this is actually payment initiation. So what I would say is that up until very recently, the UK has been very insular, looking after the CMA requirements and just not really paying attention to what's going on in the rest of Europe.
Yeah.
And I think Brexit has contributed to that, certainly in terms of the mindset.
Yeah.
So suddenly, I think it was about 3 weeks ago, Open Banking woke up and said, whoa, we ought to be doing something about PSD2 as well, send out a circular to get their remit extended to cover PSD2. So I would say that they are actually late to the party, certainly in terms of the payment initiation. They're trying to do some catching up. Other organisations have been looking at this for a significantly longer time.
Yeah.
So certainly in that space, I don't think that CMA/open banking is going to be first cab off the rank with the API standards. Chris, you
Yeah, I think obviously they've come out of the bat, and one of the first things was actually it's actually been pretty good working with some of the UK banks to actually get them match fit. It's actually pretty good that the API wasn't like a super robust heavy industrial. It was just public data, because already you expose a lot of issues within a bank or several banks for them actually operating something like that in a new channel. So that, if anything, I just advise copy what the CMA has done in terms of a national body to get your banks working together and exposing these problems together. I think, has it provided a standard? Yes, but has it provided a conformant PSD2 standard? Not at all. And it will be interesting as well. I would really avoid thinking that the CMA is going to provide the golden ticket standard, because there are other European organisations that are doing really good standardisation. But I think the key question as well, I should just float out there, is whether or not the CMA work is going to be interoperable with Europe, particularly with the sort of, the UK is not on 2022 and etc. So it'll be interesting to see that.
Okay, cool. Well, the next question in from the audience, it's a long one again, so forgive me while I read this. But if a ASPSP has no real-time middleware and just a front end which actually sends the payment instruction to the back end core banking systems, will they need to upgrade the IT infrastructure? What status do they have to provide to the PISP, and what checks have to be made real-time? Guys, Tom.
This is free consultancy now.
I think this is a really interesting one, because this is an area in which the original legislation and the RTS are pretty much completely silent as to how this is actually going to get executed. So certainly in mainland Europe, there is no faster payments yet. SCA is coming along next year, but there's no faster payments. So the best that the bank can do is to say to the payment initiator, yep, we've validated that payment to the maximum extent that we can, and we put it into the hopper, and it will go off in tonight's batch. With a bit of luck, it will get applied by the beneficiary's account tomorrow. However, there's still a possibility that maybe the account that you're trying to credit is closed, in which case the payment will be rejected tomorrow or the day after or whatever. So it really is the best of endeavours in Europe and indeed in the UK if you're using banks. However, across faster payments, we have the request response mechanism, whereby a response comes back within max 20 seconds, typically a lot less. So, key question, should the API, if indeed we are using an API, should the API wait for the response back from faster payments and the faster payments response be put into the API response, or should it just be that the API fires off the faster payments and says, well, we put in faster payments, fingers crossed, it'll probably be okay, just the same as it does for SEPA. So there's no real answer to that, and I think it's going to be up to individual banks to decide what is the art of the possible. And that mantra, I think, is going to be more generally applicable. There is not sufficient detail in the PSD2 or the RTS to say, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, so banks will have to kind of do the best they can, keep their fingers crossed that the regulator doesn't jump on them. Which checks have to be executed in real time? Fraud prevention, well, yeah, absolutely, you can't get away from that. You've got to do fraud prevention when you do SCA, it's there in the RTS. And as we were discussing earlier, as well as fraud prevention, if you want to give your customers a smooth experience, then you should also be doing risk analysis, so you may be able to exempt them from SCA.
Yeah, technically you don't have to sort of actually do it real time to conform. However, fraud prevention is a bit of a weird one. There's kind of matching against an existing record, which is actually quite difficult. To go a bit more complex, you'd have the full data of the bank and the full history of the customer, the device, the session, and then what they're trying to do now. So it's quite a few sort of moves in one go. That, it's going to take a lot of work, and if they don't have it today, that's probably not something you want to tackle straight off. In terms of balance check, that's always been a bit of an issue. We just solved the kind of weekend balance overnight batch sort of thing, only a few years ago across the industry, and now, in order to initiate a payment, would you have to give the data in real time so that it doesn't go back and then actually get a rejection, to Tom's point. So not everything has to be real time, but it would help if people start looking at building in real time.
Cool. Okay. Another question from the audience. So 90 days of transaction data can be returned as long as sensitive data is not disclosed. So would you not agree that 90 days of transaction data is not sensitive data?
I think the RTS says it's not sensitive data. It's not classed as sensitive data. So
there's a few negatives in that statement.
Yeah.
Let's boil that one down to: do we think that 90 days of transaction data is not sensitive data? I think that it all depends. As Chris said, if I get your transaction history for the last 90 days, I can see what you bought, where you bought it, when you bought it, how much you spent on it. I can very quickly build up a profile of your habits, and I can learn an awful lot about you. Yeah. So, in one sense, it's not sensitive data, but in another sense, yeah, absolutely it is. It's enabling whoever owns that data or whoever holds that data to build up quite an accurate profile of me and my behaviour. Yeah.
We didn't go into much detail, but the GDPR, there are going to be some conflicts, and we need to work through that as an industry to agree the best way forward. The kind of the second thing is, as to that point, it says that you give the data based on what the customer says or agrees that the service you're providing.
Yeah.
And it goes back to what I call is the agreement problem, which is you put everything in a very long document and I just click agree and that's okay. So whatever they're asking for, you're not going to read it anyway. The third part for this is the 90 days of sensitive data. We used to think about this as redaction. One of the issues of redaction, or at least the benefits of redaction previously, was people don't want to know that you've got a medical condition, or, in the case of sort of Uber and having affairs and that sort of stuff. There are all types of ID markers and location markers and purchases, anyone who's worked for a credit card and can you remove that off my bill, etc., all that sort of stuff. And that's all getting out there. So do we agree that it's not 98% of data? We do, personally, but EBA doesn't.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So another one is reference to ISO 22000. Make any other implementation that is not XML based be out of compliance.
I don't think they mentioned XML. We certainly know that the ISO 2022 RESTful group is working quite closely with Berlin Group and ERPB. I haven't heard anything about putting XML out of whack. I think they're, as long as they're conformity 2022, but I haven't checked that recently.
Yeah, I think I'm just looking for the exact reference, but the RTS does say that you must use here we are, dedicated interfaces. So that's the first important thing. If you're using the existing online HTML interface, then you don't have to conform to ISO 20022. That was actually one of the flags that we raised on the draft. So if you are providing a dedicated interface, then you should use ISO 20022 elements, because that is the standard for financial messaging. So that's point 17. And then Article 28.3 says ASPSP shall ensure that the dedicated interface uses ISO 20022 elements, components, or approved message definitions for financial messaging. So that does give you a bit of wriggle room. As Chris said, it doesn't have to be XML. It could be expressed as JSON, for example, but you do have to use ISO 20022 elements, components, etc. So you can't just kind of make up your own non-ISO 20022 JSON format. It has to be ISO 20022 based.
Okay, perfect. Well, I think we need to leave the questions there because we're running out of time.
Email.
A good number of questions in. Absolutely, email us. If we go to the next slide, we should also be able to see where we're going to be in person. So you'll be able to come and see it at a number of events, including this week. Chris is in Amsterdam this week.
Tomorrow,
and a number of things. CAPS here, if you're coming to the CAPS group.
Yeah.
In London at St Patrick's Day, I promised to cook a chocolate Guinness cake, so that should be enough to get you here. So there's also an email address there that you can contact us on. So we hope you've enjoyed today's session and you found it interesting and informative. As we said, should be available later for download as well. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.